Thank you and good morning. Very interesting hearing Darlene's life history, because many of the points that she raised or implied in her presentation I will pick out of systematically from research. We've got a huge number of cross-sectional studies in relationship to gender, looking at 14-year-olds, looking at 16-year-olds, whatever. We've actually taken a rather different perspective in looking at the research on inequalities and differences between boys and girls, because we think it's really important to look at a life trajectory in respect of these differences. And some of the research is critical for really gaining an appropriate understanding of the nature of the problem, because only if we understand the nature of the problem appropriately will the kind of solutions that we can adopt, I believe, really bring the kind of benefits that we want. For this presentation, I'm going to bring an unashamed human capital approach to it. I'm interested in the human capital represented by individuals. They utilise that, society utilises that, so does the economy. And you will see in the press release that I talked about the notion of waste of talent. That's the kind of perspective I'm going to take this morning. Okay, so let's just look at this. A lot of the subtleties have been ignored. And it's because, of course, gender is so widely discussed in so many contexts and by so many groups. John Marks in 2001 actually highlighted the problem in England and said there's a really big problem of underperforming boys. What we need is to attend to their styles of learning. I'd argue that's absolutely wrong. And by the end of the presentation, I'll present evidence that I think will suggest that is the case. There are very complex social phenomena behind it. And it's not a new problem. If we'd actually used raw scores when we had grammar schools and secondary modern rather more widely throughout the country, then the grammar schools would have been full of girls. And Tom Benton's presentation is going to emphasise the same point. This is really complex. And as I run through the research at a breakneck speed, I think you'll begin to get a perspective on this. And probably also, if you have children, begin to question what you do. Quite interesting. Okay, here we go. So, babies are actively processing speech before birth. Okay. Now, very, very famous experiments in America during the 1950s. Mothers put into a room, given a baby dressed in pink. The baby was cosseted, held, was shown things in a very quiet way. And then the mothers were put in another room with another baby dressed as a boy, and this baby was encouraged to go forth and interact with things and bang things. And the mothers were interviewed, and of course it was the same baby dressed differently. Okay. So if they process things in the womb, what are you doing to them? I mean, I used to shout, "Hello, baby," to my first infant as an experiment, knowing this research. And when I shouted, "Hello, baby," to her about 2 days after she was born, she would go like this. Okay. Right, what we do, even before birth, conditions their cognition. If they listen to Mozart in the womb, they respond to that music differently after birth. Maternal-infant bonding is crucial to engagement with the world. So there's been quite a lot of work done by my brother on this, and the extent to which the form of the mother-infant bond affects dramatically the way in which cognition is developing in these very early months. Gendered behaviour is an insidious element in care and development of the child. There are incredibly gendered approaches, as that 1950s experiment showed, to children, which already begins to condition what they do and how they interact with the world. It begins really, really early. And this whole genetic, gender, culture argument is the things heavily contaminate each other. Early experiences affect cognitive development in a profound way, and we know that from language. So children in non-inflected language settings lose the ability to differentiate things in inflected languages very, very quickly. So it really does matter, there's early interactions. And of course these are perpetuated, and often the gender stereotypes are rammed home through the first 6 years of life, prior to compulsory schooling. And Tom will talk about the PISA evidence. So there's strong evidence on identity and self-concept. And I'll talk later about work in mathematics, where girls say, I'm no good at maths, therefore I need to work hard to overcome that innate lack of ability. Boys, I'm good at maths, therefore I can just cram it before the examination, and I'll do incredibly well. Identity and self-concept affects dramatically approaches to learning, and it's gendered, strongly gendered. There's strong evidence in social and economic structures of the kind that Darlene was talking about. I'll give you the evidence from Kate Purcell in a minute. Strong evidence on the impact of schooling. We know that girls do better in single-sex schools. What are the implications of that for policy? How are we going to approach that? But it's very, very strong empirical evidence. This is crucial. When is preference a form of systematic disadvantage? If a child happens to show a preference for something, possibly because of early conditioning, do we go with it or do we challenge it? And what happens if that grows into a systematic disadvantage later in the economy or in learning? I'll do biology rather than physics, for example. Is difference always bias? So some of our tests actually show a very strong difference between boys and girls, and people say, oh, the test is very biased. But what if it's picking up real difference, and you're interested in that distribution of talent or ability? These are quite challenging issues. So difference is not always bias. The difficulty for policy is knowing when to push against differences which are evident in education, particularly through assessment. We need to understand global realities. I mean, you just need to read this stuff about what's happening in terms of other cultures. And the opening films were excellent in showing that you have to have culture-sensitive and culture-specific responses, even in respect of subgroups in a single nation like England, but certainly in respect to the conditions which obtain across a range of nations. But slowly, girls are climbing back into social structures in Afghanistan. It's been very hard, and the figures are stark, and there's a long way to go, and there are plenty of groups that are actually completely and utterly opposed to this kind of movement. Finland's still got massive problems. Finland is there at the top of the league tables, often cited as being the leading nation. We've done a lot of analysis, and Simon and I have discussed this, about the true trajectory of Finland. It's got very, very significant gender gaps, significantly higher than in other OECD nations. And everybody thinks, of course, all girls are doing better than all boys, because that actually is the kind of implied thing that you read from the press. But is that the relationship between the attainment of these two groups, male and female? Not at all. Is it that? Well, let's look at it. It's not that all boys are worse than all girls. These are real data, okay? From an OCR Maths GCSE, that's the difference. And if I then express the difference in this way, it's a table done by John Bell a number of years ago, you find that the major difference occurs in that range of the distribution. So we put them together, there we go. Those are real data. That's the extent of the gap. But what's really, really interesting, of course, and let's look at this to make it really clear, and this is a table that Tom kindly provided, Tom Benton. On the left you have Finland, on the right you have the United Kingdom. You have a very interesting effect here. Just consider this bit of the distribution. If you have a minor increase in the general attainment of girls, for whatever reason, you can have a massive effect here. So you would see a dramatic rise in the number of girls gaining A grades or A-star grades. Now that's quite interesting. So the press is very responsive to these kind of shifts. If you get a 5% increase in A to star, the press is full of all girls accelerating ahead of all boys. And that's not true. Look at the extent to which there's commonality. This doesn't mean we should be complacent, because we should be interested in why this is happening. And there's some research which I'll cite towards the end of the presentation, which suggests that this idea of a boy-friendly pedagogy is extremely problematic and dangerous. But these are realities. Now, this isn't great when we come on to qualifications data. This is why, oh God, yet again another conference about gender. The point is these problems are incredibly persistent. Despite the fact we've had WISE, the Women into Science Education and so on, loads of initiatives, the fantastic work done by Sheri Kutu on mentoring within schools, these things are very difficult to shift. Well, of course they're difficult to shift if girls and boys assume particular gendered identities, in the first 6 months of life. These are going to be difficult to shift. But they're very evident in the qualifications data. So light blue is male, this is female, combined science, there are differences. And it doesn't look that crucial until you begin to look at the single sciences. You know, male entries into biology, interestingly, larger. Oh, well, everybody knows that females prefer biology rather than physics, so what's the problem? Well, look at the physics. Now, this is overrepresented, dramatically. Hang on a minute, what this says is that girls are being pushed into combined sciences. Now, that's really serious in terms of applying to science-intensive courses in higher education later. What we find in these data, by the way, is an overall story, which is that attainment really matters in GCSE, and that translates into your subject choices post-16. And those subject choices really matter in terms of what you can subsequently do. And so tiny effects in terms of your preferences translate into minor differences in attainment, which translate into major decisions in terms of subject, which have major implications for what you can subsequently do. That's why it's all so persistent. That's why it's all so difficult to address. So there we go, English literature. Boy, look at the girls and look at the boys. Biology, again. Oh, here we go. And oh, here we go. Physics. Okay. Now actually physics is really fundamental to a whole series of occupations. And we think that these kind of differences in terms of combined science, in terms of which single sciences you do post-16, do translate into differential attainment, which is detectable when children apply to medical education. Okay, very interesting. And what we do, we detect there when we deploy really good tests, major differences between female and male attainment, and they could obtain from these kind of differences in subject choices. Mathematics, still the most popular A-level, and increasing actually, still heavily gendered. Joe Bowler's work and others' work, excellent work on the nature of the culture within mathematics lessons, I'll come on to in a moment, which suggests that there are problems in terms of how to encourage female attainment. So what you find here is quite interesting. If you look at the proportion of students gaining A relative to the cohort in physics, okay, you find a great discrepancy. Here, you find that the females that actually do it do really well. And what we find is that their identity is quite interesting. If they choose to do physics, they're absolutely determined to do well. But they're not encouraged to participate. Right, another insight, so you need to put all this together in the next sort of 4 or 5 minutes in your minds. The brackets are important. This is gendered perceptions of occupations amongst Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 pupils. This table is for Key Stage 2, and the brackets are the views of these kids about occupations in Key Stage 1. And what you find is that during schooling, gendered perceptions of children diminish, they do not increase. So in Key Stage 1, 53% of kids thought an accountant could be of equally male or female, but by Key Stage 2, 71% think it could be equal. That's interesting. So the kids have a less gendered perception of these occupations as they pass through primary schooling. Nursing, okay, interestingly also, and critically science, Annette, from 50 to 78%. These are interesting improvements. So what kids are experiencing in school is actually disrupting beneficially gendered perceptions of occupations. Girls are now achieving better academic results. Relatively fewer young women are choosing science. Boys dominate in maths, science and technology in A-level. And critically, we then move on to occupations. What happens is the gendered perceptions cut in during subject choice, particularly at A-level, but also at GCSE, but particularly at A-level. Now, degree utilisation is also important. Women attain well. They get good results. They go to university. But do they go into occupations in which what it is that they have done in education is actually utilised? And the evidence on that is not great. They go into a whole range of occupations in which the degrees are not a formal requirement. So in terms of human capital and in terms of public expenditure, both the individuals and society in England are expending a vast amount of resource on education, which is then not made available to the economy for a whole series of reasons about access, about choices by the people themselves and by those admitting people to occupations. We did undertake work, and I was working with Mike and Molly when they did this work, on schools that had consistently closed the gender gap, and we could not find the schools. In other words, no school had a trajectory over about 15 or 10-year period where they consistently, systematically closed the gap between boys and girls. Again, this points to the persistence and the difficulty of addressing the problem. And the project actually outlined 4 forms of intervention that were actually required and were evidence from those schools which had done well. But it's complex and sensitive and can be easily disturbed. What are the successes in England? The Open University has been a fantastic success for women and undoubtedly increased the divorce rate in certain families. Singapore Polytechnics opening up a route to women who did not have top academic attainment but wanted to continue in high-status technical education and enter the labour market has been a fantastic success in Singapore, and it's been a deliberate policy objective. And back to preferences, we know there are physiological and morphological differences in the brain between boys and girls. We know that boys actually prefer certain activities in terms of 3D representation, for example. Girls were bad at the two-dimensional representation of three-dimensional objects in maths education until we included that in the national curriculum, at which point, when it was required, and the preferences of girls to avoid it were no longer actually recognised and worked to by teachers, they were forced to do it, their attainment then exceeded boys. So this kind of approach within national curricula actually works. Now to finish, Bennett, I'm just going to race through these slides. I pick up absolutely what Darlene was saying. Kate Purcell looked at and the research group around her looked at wage distribution, the extent of difference, and what contexts in which gender difference did not seem to make a difference to progression and earnings. And it seems to relate entirely to control. And if you have, say, female bank managers, because they have low index of control in relationship to their occupation, it has a big impact on their earnings when they have children. If you're a GP, because they have a very high index of control over their contract, if they have children, then it has far less impact on their earnings and their occupational status. So control factors, rather than culture and other things, seems to be the most dominant issue in relationship to earnings. I'm not saying that culture is unimportant, I'm saying that control factors are absolutely critical and have been ignored. What is... Oh, sorry, go back, I can't go back, I can go back, good. Now, what's happening, of course, is a rapid restructuring of the labour market, and I'll end on that and the point about boy-friendly pedagogy. The IPPR research has actually highlighted the extent to which breadwinners, female breadwinners, have actually increased. And this is really happening very, very fast. And it appears in a society like England, where there are increasingly 2 breadwinners, and the family decides to have children, households are making a rational choice in respect of which person has the greatest likelihood of the highest earnings. And they are making that choice rationally, and they are not making it in terms of whether it's the male or the female breadwinner. And that is increasing in households. In Germany, by the way, post-44 Reconstruction policy kept women deliberately at home. And primary schools only sat in the morning until very, very recently. Kids only went to school in the mornings in the primary segment of the German education system. And the tax system, fiscal systems were developed in order to stimulate and support that kind of social organisation. And they've recently changed that because they've recognised that they need to make those kind of changes to maximise talent availability to the economy. What we're seeing in other other European nations, there's a similar increase in the number of female breadwinners. But the wage distribution is very, very different. So in England, typically, these female breadwinners are in low income brackets, okay, or in bottom half of the income scale. Whereas in countries like the Netherlands, female breadwinners are represented evenly across all income brackets. So in other words, you have to have a life trajectory view. You have to look at it in terms of early identity formation, the development of preferences, the extent to which the education system goes with or challenges those preferences at a deep cognitive level as well as a social level. You have to look at it in terms of the subtle differences in attainment, which can make a difference in terms of subject choice, the differences that those subject choice mean in terms of higher education and access to the labour market, and the extent to which the labour market is structured in such a way that it reinforces stereotypes and so on, and signals those back into the education system and youth. The final point is this. A number of people from John Marks onwards have said, because we have such a large problem with under-attaining boys, we have to have boy-friendly pedagogy in schools. I would argue that the evidence from Joe Bowler and others is exactly the reverse. That the kind of strategies that girls use, I am not innately good at this, therefore I have to work hard, have been empirically shown to benefit boys as well. And it is actually the examination of what optimizes attainment and making it available to all social groups by which we will reduce these differences. Thank you very much indeed.